Good morning, everybody. Couple of caveats before I start, I suppose. Sorry, I had a towel around my neck. Couple of caveats before I don't know if the PowerPoint's going to work or not. I sent it through to Rory this morning. I had to put it together on my phone because my laptop battery died. If it does work, there are probably going to be many typos. So I'll just correct those as we go, I suppose. I also have absolutely no idea how long the sermon is going to take. For one of the very few times in my life, I didn't actually have the time I like to actively rehearse what I'm going to say, and I didn't have the chance to do that in the process of the move. So we could be done in 5 minutes, we could be done in 5 hours. We'll see where we're at by the end of it. The only thing is we have to be gone by 1 o'clock to catch a flight, so we'll be done by 1. That's all I can, or we might not be done by 1, I'll just leave. Really nice opportunity to have a chat to you before we leave this afternoon. It's been an incredible 12, 13, 14 years, I think, since I officially moved over to this congregation from Pinetown. All because of a girl who I kind of love, so it was worth it in the end. And it's weird when you're we won't be back for at least another year and a half, 2 years probably, before we find our way back to South Africa. And it's a new year, and now you're going, so you don't really know what to talk about. Do you talk about the saying goodbye thing, or do you talk about the going into a new year thing, or do you do something completely different and talk about none of those things and leave that to Brian next week? And I didn't really know what I wanted to talk about, but one of the things over the last few years that I've been able to do is I've read this year more than I have in any other years, and there's one author whose work has particularly stuck with me. It's an author by the name of Malcolm Gladwell, and he's a couple of years, I suppose 2 years ago now, during the pandemic, I guess. I did a Bible study series on things like unintended consequences, and I used a lot of Malcolm Gladwell's examples in that. And this morning's sermon he's not religious in any way. But the topics that he uses are quite profound. And I'm going to lean quite heavily on one of the topics in his book, which I won't tell you the name of because we'll give away where we're going. But it's really, what I've done is I've put a Christian angle on, he's kind of going to go in, and he stops a little bit short of where I feel that he should be going with this particular story. So I'm going to tell you a story this morning. It's a story you know well, but perhaps you're going to look at it at a slightly different perspective. But if you have children or you've ever told stories, you know how it all works. Story, moral at the end. I'm doing it the other way around. So I'm going to start this morning by telling you what the morals are, and then I'm going to go in and tell you the story itself, and perhaps we will take something of it that we can go into the new year. So the two morals are this, and Rory, I should have them up if it clicks through. The two morals are this. The first one is to be successful. I hope you can read that. That should be all right. To be successful, you need to know yourself and you need to know your strengths. And the second moral is to be successful, you need to know your enemies or your opponents or your challenges, whatever word you want to slot in there, and what their weaknesses are. Now let's go into the story. It's a story we know. There's a little bit of, it's talking about war, there's a little bit of violence in it, but don't worry, it's not graphic or not gratuitous. Don't worry, children will be absolutely fine for this one. In fact, children have heard this story so many times that this is going to be bread and butter, the story itself, and then we'll go into a little bit afterwards. It takes place in an area called the Shephelah. Now, I've got a map up to have a look at where we are. It's not particularly clear, but you can see that light white, grayish, off yellow color down the middle. That's the area known as the Shephelah. The Shephelah is in what is now modern day Israel on the eastern side, on the western side, so it's my right, is the western coast. That's where Tel Aviv is now, the coastal cities of modern day Israel. And on the other side is a mountain range, the eastern mountain range that runs through. And that's where all the major cities, so that's where Jerusalem is, that's where Hebron was in the Old Testament. That is where kind of all Bethlehem is in that area. So the area we're looking at is this bit in the middle. It's known as the Shephelah. And the Shephelah was an incredibly important area, and in fact, it is still incredibly important at the moment. In modern day geopolitics, The Shephelah, one of the reasons that Israel is not a particularly big nation, but one of the reasons that Israel is such an important nation is its strategic position globally. It is pretty much bang in the middle of where things need to be. No matter where you go, Israel's right in the middle. It's why it's so strategically important. It's why there are so many foreign nations that are involved in that area. But that was also the case historically, because you had all your armies coming in from the west, all your seafaring nations coming in on their ships from the western nations, and they would hit that coastline. The coastline was quite easy to land on. Cities were quite easy to be established. And then you would have the mountain ranges on the side where the vineyards were, where everything else is, and then you would have this valley in the middle. And this valley effectively protected the big cities in the mountain ranges from those marauding armies from the west. So seafarers would come in, and your armies would defend that mountain range. Now, those mountain ranges, even today, are incredibly important for agriculture, for production. There are vineyards now. There would have been vineyards then. It was an incredibly strategically important area. If an army from the west, from the coast, managed to cross the Shephelah and get into the highlands, those cities could fall. Now, if you know your biblical history, very often the nations in Jerusalem had to protect themselves from the east. They didn't really have to protect themselves from the west that much because they were protected by this area called the Shephelah. Because you would have to come in, you would have to climb up a mountain range, and then you would have to drop down into the Shephelah, which is a valley. In fact, the word Shephelah translates to low or lowland. So you would have to climb a mountain, drop down into a valley, climb another mountain on the other side for those cities to fall. Now, that was incredibly difficult to do. I don't know if you know this, but about 20-odd years ago, South Africa went to war with a country called the Lesotho for 3 days. It didn't go very well because Lesotho is known as the Mountain Kingdom. The South African armies went up the hill, the Lesotho army responded. Mandela had to come back from an international trip because Mangosuthu Buthelezi was acting prime minister at the time, and he tried to declare war. It was the weirdest 3 days. South Africa's had a weird history, but those 3 days were particularly strange. Same kind of thing, you were protected. So now for our story, the Shephelah is incredibly, incredibly important. And you might not have heard of it, but you do know exactly the area that I'm talking about. Because our story, around about 3,000 years ago, takes place in the Shephelah, in particular, the Valley of Elah. Now, again, I'm not going to give away the name of the story just yet, but I'm 99.9% sure that the clues I'm going to give you will tell you what the story is before we get there. So we're in the Shephelah, we're in the lowlands, we're in the valley, we're in a particular area called the Valley of Elah, and the situation that I described about a coastal army coming up from the west is exactly what happens about 3,000 years ago with the story. It's a seafaring nation called the Philistines. The Philistines come up, they hit the coast, they realize that the major cities are on top of the hill, they make their way up the one side of the Shephelah. Now the defending armies see this coming, hear this coming. Armies back then, 3,000 years ago, were very loud. This was no stealth warfare. They came down from where they were, from the cities, and they basically banked on the other side. So you've got the attacking army on this side from the west along the coast, and you've got the defending armies camped up from the east, and they are stuck across each other. And they are completely bedded in. None of them can move, because to get to the other army, you had to drop down into the valley. And you were an absolute sitting duck if you dropped down into the valley, because you would just be attacked from the top. So neither army wanted to advance first, because it was certain death. So there they were, stuck and camped. Now, I don't know if you remember that old Telkom advert. It was one of the very first Telkom adverts in the early 1990s, with the two old men who were in their rondavels in the Transkei, and one was on one hilltop and the other man was on the other hilltop, and he picks up his phone and he rings his neighbor, and his neighbor picks up his phone and he sticks his head out the window and shouts, "Molo mhlego wam." And that's exactly what happens in this setting. You've got two armies effectively shouting at each other from the top of a hill. None of them can advance, none of them can move, and they are stuck. Now, you can imagine with armies, especially big armies, resources start running out after a couple of weeks. You're both on the top of a hill, so in order to get resources, you have to go back down, especially the coastal army has to drop back down to the coast, replenish in the coastal cities, come back up. No one wants to move because you're at a point of impasse. You are just completely stuck and completely done. So something happens, and this was very common in ancient warfare. You had a soldier comes down and shouts, This man was huge. He was just under 7 foot. He wore the best armor, had the biggest sword, had a helmet made of bronze, and he rocks up and he says, "I will challenge you to a one-on-one fight." Sure, we know where the story is, right? But the problem with this guy is this guy was so big, no one wanted to respond, because the rules of engagement for one-on-one hand-to-hand combat, this kind of thing, it wasn't a once-off. This was an established part of war. And basically what it was is, whoever wins that battle wins the war. You stood in for your entire army. So no one wants to go, because they look at this dude. He's 7 foot. I'm 5 foot, not much. And 7 foot is that high, probably. And that's excluding the armor, that's excluding the helmets on top. The sword would have been bigger than he was. This guy was terrifying. No one wants to fight against him, because you fight against him, you lose. You lose, your army loses. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a responsibility at work where the entire project comes down to you, and you're stressing because if you don't do your job, the entire job fails. Imagine you're defending your nation, and it's all on you. No one wants to go. This guy is standing on the one side, shouting at him. A couple of days this happened, no one comes. Then a small kid comes along. I say small kid, that's probably a bit derogatory. A young man comes across, and he goes, "What is this? I'll take him on. I'll fight." And everyone goes, No, you won't. There's a great phrase that says, "You are but a youth. This man has been a fighter from his youth." That is a great turn of phrase. If you love language, that's a great way of saying it. And this young guy goes, "But I've done it. I've done this stuff. I can take him on." And ultimately, the leader has to say yes, because no one else is saying yes. And you can't just stand there for days and days and days, and weeks and months and months with nothing happening. So he says, "Fine, you can go fight, but you have to wear armor at least." And he puts the armor on. He says, I can't wear this armor. And the phrase that's used is, "I haven't tested it." So it's not just like, often when we read about the story, the armor was probably too big, but it was also armor that had never been worn before. I don't even like using a pen I haven't used before, let alone full-on armor and a sword. So this kid says, "No, I'm going with a stick and a sling. That's all I'm going with." And everyone looks at him and goes, "Okay, it's your funeral." So in he goes down into the valley and squares up with this giant. Now, we know the story by now. It's the story of David and Goliath. And I'm just going to keep a picture up just for a little bit, because we know how the story ends. David drops down into the valley. Goliath is standing there. David picks up some stones, puts them in his sling. Bible with the children's church song, and the sling goes round and round, and round and round and round and round and round, and round and round and round and round. Up in the air, giant falls to the ground. We know that song, right? We've heard the story so many times, and that's exactly what happens. And then something else happens to Goliath, but because they're children here, I won't repeat it, but the adults know what happens to him at that point. And then the Israelite army completely routs the Philistines. They take over, because that's the rules of engagement. Whoever wins this battle engages for the rest of the war. And that is exactly what happens in the story. And it's a story we know well. And what a story, right? What an underdog story. It's this kid who defeats this giant. It's this inexperienced fighter who defeats the world champion. But is it really an underdog story? Maybe we've been looking at the story slightly wrong. Maybe we've been looking at it from the perspective of the Israelite army standing on the side of the mountain. Let's delve down a little bit into the two characters in the story. And then we'll go back to our two morals. I'll add a third moral, which I deliberately left off. And then I'll give you a couple of things for us to take away. So let's pull up the first little bit that we got here. Let's talk about Goliath. Now, Goliath was what you would call heavy infantry. So in ancient warfare, there were three types of soldiers. There was the cavalry. The cavalry is horses, chariots, anything that moves or rides, basically, is the cavalry. That's still the phrase that's largely used in modern warfare. Then you have the heavy infantry. The heavy infantry are the fighters. So in modern warfare, you can imagine these are the guys running around with the helmets and breastplates and guns. That's the heavy infantry. These are swords, these are shields, these are armor, these are this kind of thing. Then the third category is artillery. Artillery is anything that shoots. any projectile, right? So it's archers mainly was the main one. Slingers was a big one. As warfare got more developed, it was cannons would fall under this. Anything that would shoot, long distances, medium distances would be the artillery. Goliath was heavy infantry. Goliath wanted a close-up fight. Close contact, one-on-one contact was his game. Now just look at what he shouts when he talks to the Israelite army. He shouts here, he says, "Come to me." This is when David comes down to him. He says, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." That phrase, "come to me," is really important. Do you know in verses 43 to verses 45, that phrase, "come to me," or "I will come to you," a variant of that, is used 4 times in 3 verses. See, that is the type of battle that Goliath wanted. He wanted David, or whoever the challenger was, to come to him. Close combat was his game. In fact, even Saul thought the battle was going to be close combat. Saul says to David, "Take my armor." Why would you give armor to someone that's going to be 20 meters away? Everyone expected close combat because that's what this was. David comes up for battle. Goliath is expecting close combat. Saul expects it. The armies expect it. Everyone expects this hand-to-hand combat. Okay, so that's the first thing. The type of battle that we're expecting in the story, or everyone else is expecting in the story, we know the end of it, so we know that this wasn't David's plan, but everyone is expecting close combat. Now let's have a look at something else that's going on with Goliath in the background, and the scripture hints to this. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Sorry, if you want to follow with and read through it a bit later. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Let's have a look a little bit more about Goliath. Now let's go to the next slide. This is the before the fight is even happening. I'm sorry, this is probably too small. I'm sorry if you can't see it. I will make this available if anyone wants to have a look at the PowerPoints. I'll pop it through on WhatsApp to Brian, and Brian can share it if anyone wants to have a look. Look how he comes down to battle. And this all plays out in verses 43 through to the 40s of that passages. He comes down with his sword bearer in front of him. Now that doesn't sound really significant, does it? Your sword bearer goes in front of you. But the battle hasn't started. So why would the sword bearer be in front of him? I mean, this is a 7-foot warrior. Why does he need someone leading him down a mountain? First thing to notice in this passage, he's being led down a mountain. Then the second thing that we notice in verse 43, and this is where it starts getting really interesting, he says, when David rocks up and he sees that David's not wearing armor, so David's come quite close to him, he says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Sticks? Plural? If you want to pop back, you can pop back to the various passages. In verse 40, it says this, when David takes Saul's armor off, the passage says, "And then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine." Stick, not sticks. But Goliath specifically says, "You come to me with sticks." That's a bit strange. I mean, the Bible's not inaccurate here. Next thing, we see that the Bible specifically points out that before throwing the sling, and this is the one part of the Sunday school story we don't get, David ran quickly before slinging. So that means at some point, David was fairly close. He then ran quickly and threw the sling. Okay. This doesn't sound like Goliath was all that good, does it? Don't know if you know this about tall people. And we have a few tall-ish people here. We have no one here who is freakishly tall. We don't have any of those sort of people here. But there is a common medical thing that happens to people who tend to be exceptionally tall, and I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of this, but it's acromegaly or acromegaly or acro something MAGLY. And basically, it's a non-cancerous tumor that often pushes against the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland in your brain is the one that produces growth hormone, human growth hormone, which is the stuff that most steroids are made of, right? But the problem is, with this stuff, is if the growth is in the right place, your pituitary gland doesn't stop producing human growth hormone. So you tend to grow and get exceptionally tall. The tallest man who ever lived was a man who was 24 years old at the time he died, and he was 8'11" at the time he died, when he was 24 years old, and he was still growing at the time of his death. He had diagnosed acromegaly, that thing. The wrestler, Andre the Giant from the 80s, massive dude, diagnosed acromegaly. See, it's a very common thing with very exceptionally tall people that you have this deficiency that makes you as tall. The problem is, it seriously affects your eyesight. It makes you incredibly short-sighted. It often gives you double vision, and it often makes you slow. It also affects your movement. Now let's look at that, and this has been around from the 1960s. The first medical journal to publish this, did Goliath have acromegaly, was in the 1960s in the, I nearly said Indonesian, it was the Illinois Medical Journal in America. This is a man who moved slowly because David ran quickly away from him. He saw sticks when there was only one stick and maybe a sling. He needed to be led down a hillside, and David got really close before he realized what was going on. Perhaps Goliath wasn't as terrifying as it was. Maybe Goliath relied on his size and on his history to scare people. And then maybe he drew people in to the type of fight he wanted. And let's be honest, you are not going to win a sword fight with a 7-foot guy who can just swing a sword and take you out. But that is not the fight that David engaged in. So maybe Goliath wasn't as dangerous as everyone thought. Now let's look at David. Let's look at David ourselves. So we look at Goliath. Goliath has got some obvious issues going on here. Then we have a look at David himself. We'll go again to the type of combat. David was artillery. And when you think about the sling, I don't know if you've even used the phrase, but he only had a sling. Let's not pretend that this was a kid's catty. This was not a toy. This was a deadly piece of military equipment. When he was slinging that sling round and 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 round, he's doing 5 or 6 revolutions a second as it's spinning. As the stones shoot out, it has the ballistic stopping force of roughly the same, a little bit less than, a 45 caliber handgun. They were also incredibly accurate. Slingers and archers were ridiculously. There are ancient tapestries that show slingers hitting birds in flight. This is not a toy. This is not bringing a water gun to a skirmish. This is a proper piece of equipment. Now, I didn't know this, but it turns out that the stones in that particular valley, the Valley of Elah, are denser than stones in other places. Now, stone density is a whole thing. If anyone's ever done any kind of rock climbing or stuff like that, sandstone is quite brittle. It breaks quite easily. Certain types of sand make better bricks because the density is better and all that kind of stuff. The stones in this particular valley are more dense than the stones that you would find elsewhere. So you've got David, incredibly accurate, fast, with thick stones, and a weapon that can shoot at the force of a handgun, against a guy who can't see very well, and who can't move, and who's weighed down by heavy armor. Is David really the underdog in the story? Perhaps not. From the outside, yes, David looks like the underdog. You've got the giant and you've got the kid. Of course it looks like an underdog story. Did David see something that perhaps we aren't? Let's go across to the next slide. I want to run through one last thing, and then we'll end on this. The other thing that's really important to realize is that David had local knowledge. This is the Philistine army that landed in the coast. They're a seafaring nation. They would have landed, they would have acclimatized, they would have got to the mountain. David is a shepherd in this area. We read from this passage in 1 Samuel chapter 17 that he came from the fields to the battlefront. He knew this area well. He knew those stones. He knew the sling. He knew the mountain range. David was prepared for that particular area. We also read from this passage that David killed bears and lions while protecting his flock. And I know what I've always pictured in my life. I've pictured David wrestling a bear. We aren't told he wrestled them. All we know is that he killed them. He defeated them. We do know from this passage that he often killed off the animal from close hand contact. He talks about how he grabs the animal by its beard and slayed it. But it also says that he struck. This passage says it at least 2 or 3 times. He struck the animal. I've always pictured him fighting hand-to-hand combat with a bear. What's more likely? He shot his sling at him. That would be like having a rifle and choosing to punch. David wouldn't have done that. See, David knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe David is not the underdog to the story, because the giant probably looked bigger than it was, and David probably looked smaller than he was from the outside. Let's go to our morals. I'm sure that we got to go through our morals one more time, and then we will. Then I'll give you 3 tips. 3 tips before we go. So we've got a couple of morals of the story, and we'll start with the 2 that we did in the beginning. As we go into the new year, to be successful, you have to know your strengths. You have to know what you're good at. The second one that we went through is you have to know your enemies and you have to know their weaknesses. And that is exactly what happened in this David and Goliath story. David knew what he was good at. He didn't get sucked into what Goliath was good at. Now, we have no way of knowing whether or not Goliath actually had we're not going to diagnose him from 3,000 years ago. That's not going to happen. We don't know if David knew, but you just get the sense that David felt something was off, that Goliath wasn't the threat that everyone else thought that he was. David also knew a lot about himself. David says, I've done this before, I can take on this battle. He knew himself, he knew what he was up against. But David has a secret weapon. David's secret weapon was fundamentally important. David had a rock-solid faith. I deliberately left that out. David's secret weapon wasn't so secret at all if you know the story. He comes down, he says, Goliath says to him, "What, you come to me with sticks?" And he says, "No." He says, "I come to you with the Lord my God." See, David knew himself, he knew his enemy, and this is the third moral. If you want to be successful, if you want to be strong as a Christian, strong in your personal life, strong in your relationships, strong, if you want to be successful in general, if you want a prosperous new year, you know yourself, you know what you're up against, but most importantly, you know your God. And you stick close to him. And you know that nothing has been wasted, that everything that has happened to this point has been done for a reason to get you into those battles. And if you know God, and you know yourself, and you take the time to know what you're up against, perhaps our Goliaths in our life aren't as big as we think they are. And we probably aren't as small as we think we are. No tasks are insurmountable. So, 3 things that I would like to leave you with this morning. And I hope we're going to have time to chat a little bit, and if we don't get a chance to say goodbye to everyone, we've got a few things to do and then catch a flight, and trying to think of 3 things that I can leave you with that will maybe stick and maybe, last beyond until maybe I'll see you again in a couple of years' time and you'll still remember them, I don't know. But 3 things that I would like to leave you with this morning is the first thing that you need to do if you're going into the new year is know your God and know the journey that you have walked with him. Nothing is by mistake. You are here for a reason. You have been delivered for a reason. Everything has been built to set up to where you are today. There's that very, very powerful passage, and sometimes we just skip over it, but it says, all things work out for the good of those who love him, those who believe in him, those who have faith in him. Know your God, know your journey, trust your journey, and trust him. Build your next year on that foundation. Start there. Secondly, know yourself. You are not the underdog that you might think you are. You are loved. You are created by a powerful God. You are stronger than you can imagine, emotionally, spiritually. You are backed by the creator of this world who crafted you. You are a sibling of Christ. You are a son of the Most High. Don't underestimate yourself. You are incredibly, incredibly powerful. So build 2023 on the foundation of who your God is and the journey that He has worked you on. And then know who you are in relation to Him. And the third thing is know what you are up against. And remember that we don't have to shrink, because every now and then, even the biggest tasks probably aren't as big as we think they are. Goliath seemed impossible to beat. David realized that Goliath wasn't as dangerous as he thought. And I suppose so often, if we know who God is and we know ourselves, even the biggest challenge gets made a lot smaller. It has been one of the absolute joys of my last 10 years or so to be part of this congregation and to spend time with all of you. And I know that the connections that we built over that last however many years are not going to go anywhere, and I'm sure we'll be around, and I'm still going to be online, and we saw a couple of weeks ago that video sermons work. Maybe I'll speak to you remotely sometime down the line. So I just want to say thank you to the Church of Mary family for everything you've done for us, the way you've supported us and helped us over the last few years. And I just hope that the message that I've left you with this morning is one that can set you up for the new year. Very often it's said that a preacher speaks to themselves, and I think with what we're going into for the next year, I think those three fundamentals are something for us. So thank you very much. I hope the message meant to you, and I hope that you are blessed for the year ahead. Let's say a quick word of prayer before I sit down. Lord and Father, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak to this congregation that has meant such a big part of our lives, Father. We thank you so much for everything this congregation has done for our family, Father, for the support they've given, for the advice, just for making sure that we are walking down the right path, Father. Father, we just pray that as we go into a new year, that you allow us to build our life on the foundation of knowledge of who you are, of who we are in relation to you, and using those two building blocks that we are able to tackle whatever the year throws up for us. We pray this in your Son's almighty name. Amen.